Marcus Thompson had lived alone on the Eagles Rest Ranch for nearly 15 years, ever since his wife died in childbirth along with their unborn son. The remote property sat 20 miles outside the small town of Millbrook, nestled in a valley surrounded by pine-covered hills that provided both beautiful scenery and complete isolation from his neighbors. At 42 years old, Marcus had grown accustomed to solitude. His days followed a predictable routine, tending to his cattle, maintaining his property, and making occasional trips to town for supplies. He spoke to few people during these visits, conducting his business efficiently and returning to his ranch as quickly as possible. The townspeople of Millbrook had their own opinions about Marcus Thompson. Some remembered him as a friendly young man who had been devastated by his wife's death. Others saw him as an antisocial hermit who had chosen to cut himself off from community life. Most simply forgot about him for months at a time, until he appeared in town looking rough and weathered from his isolated existence. Marcus preferred it this way. The ranch provided everything he needed: work that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, income from his cattle sales, and blessed silence that helped him avoid the well-meaning sympathy and unwanted advice of neighbors. He had built a life that functioned without requiring much interaction with other people. The ranch itself was well maintained, despite Marcus's solitary lifestyle. His cattle were healthy and his fences were strong. He had modernized some of the equipment over the years and had even installed a telephone line, though he rarely used it. The house remained much as it had been when his wife was alive, with her furniture and belongings still in place like a shrine to their brief marriage. Marcus's isolation wasn't complete. However, Dr. William Hayes, the town physician, made occasional visits to check on Marcus's health and to ensure he was managing adequately on his own. Dr. Hayes had been the one to deliver the tragic news about Marcus's wife and baby, and he felt a continuing responsibility for the grieving widower's well-being. "You can't hide from life forever, Marcus," Dr. Hayes would say during his visits. "Sarah wouldn't have wanted you to spend the rest of your life alone on this ranch." Marcus always responded politely but firmly that he was content with his chosen lifestyle. He had no interest in remarrying or rejoining the social life of Millbrook. The ranch provided all the purpose and meaning he needed. The only other regular visitor to Eagles Rest Ranch was Father Michael O'Brien from the Catholic Church in Millbrook. The elderly priest had known Marcus since childhood and refused to let him completely withdraw from human contact. Father O'Brien would arrive unannounced every few months, bringing news from town and insisting that Marcus share a meal and conversation. God didn't intend for man to live in complete isolation, Father O'Brien would remind Marcus during these visits. "You have gifts and talents that could benefit others, and you have needs that only human companionship can fulfill." Marcus appreciated the priest's concern but remained unconvinced that he needed anything beyond his current existence. He had found peace in his solitude and saw no reason to complicate his life by seeking out relationships that might bring pain or disappointment. However, Marcus's carefully constructed isolation was about to be challenged in ways he never anticipated. Changes were coming to Millbrook that would eventually reach even his remote ranch, bringing with them complications that would test his resolve to remain separate from the community that had once been his home. The winter of 1887 was particularly harsh, with heavy snows that made travel between the ranch and town difficult for weeks at a time. Marcus was well prepared for such conditions, with adequate supplies and experienced livestock management skills. But the severe weather would soon bring an unexpected visitor to his ranch, someone whose presence would change everything about his carefully ordered existence. As Marcus stood on his porch that December evening, watching snow fall steadily across his valley, he had no idea that his days of solitude were numbered. The isolation that had protected him from emotional pain for 15 years was about to be breached by circumstances beyond his control. Elizabeth Harrison had been a widow for 8 months when the blizzard struck Millbrook in December of 1887. At 24 years old, she was still adjusting to life without her husband Robert, who had died in a logging accident the previous spring. The tragedy had left her not only heartbroken, but also in precarious financial circumstances. Robert Harrison had been a well-liked man in Millbrook, working as a foreman at the local lumber mill and serving as a deacon at the Methodist church. His sudden death had shocked the entire community, and Elizabeth had been overwhelmed by the outpouring of sympathy and support from neighbors and friends. However, as the months passed, Elizabeth discovered that sympathy didn't pay bills or put food on the table. Robert's life insurance was minimal, and his position at the mill died with him. The small house they had rented became too expensive for Elizabeth's limited resources, and she was forced to take in sewing work and laundry to survive. Elizabeth was a proud woman who had been raised to be self-sufficient, but the reality of her situation was becoming desperate. The church ladies provided occasional charity, but their help came with judgment about how she should be living her life. Some suggested she should move back east to live with relatives, while others hinted that she should consider remarrying as soon as her mourning period was complete. The December blizzard caught Elizabeth unprepared. She had been walking home from Mrs. Patterson's house where she had been doing laundry when the storm intensified suddenly. The wind became so fierce that she couldn't see the road ahead, and the temperature dropped rapidly as snow began falling in thick, heavy flakes. Elizabeth realized she was lost within minutes of leaving Mrs. Patterson's property. The familiar landmarks disappeared in the swirling snow, and she couldn't determine which direction would lead her back to town. Panic began to set in as she understood the seriousness of her situation. Fighting against the wind and snow, Elizabeth stumbled through the storm for what felt like hours. Her thin coat provided little protection against the bitter cold, and her hands and feet were becoming numb. She knew that people died in blizzards like this, and she began to pray desperately for guidance and shelter. Just when Elizabeth thought she might collapse from exhaustion and cold, she saw a faint light in the distance. Summoning her remaining strength, she pushed through the deep snow toward what she hoped was a house or barn where she could find shelter. The light came from the windows of Marcus Thompson's ranch house. Elizabeth had heard of the reclusive rancher but had never met him personally. In her current desperate situation, however, she didn't care about his reputation for avoiding people. She needed help, and his ranch represented her only chance of survival. Elizabeth pounded on Marcus's front door with numb hands, calling out over the howling wind. When Marcus opened the door, he was shocked to find a young woman on his porch covered in snow and shivering violently from the cold. "Please," Elizabeth gasped. "I'm lost in the storm. I need shelter." Marcus immediately pulled Elizabeth inside and helped her to a chair near the fireplace. He had recognized her as the young widow from town, though they had never been formally introduced. His instinct for helping someone in distress overrode his usual reluctance to have visitors. "Mrs. Harrison, isn't it?" Marcus said as he wrapped a blanket around Elizabeth's shoulders. "You're safe now. Let me help you get warm." Elizabeth nodded gratefully, too cold and exhausted to speak. Marcus built up the fire and brought her hot coffee, then went to prepare his spare bedroom while she warmed herself by the hearth. "The storm is too severe for travel," Marcus explained when he returned. "You'll need to stay here until it passes. That could be several days given how this looks." Elizabeth was embarrassed by the situation but grateful for Marcus's kindness. "I don't want to impose on you, Mr. Thompson. If there's any way to get word to town, the telephone lines are down, and no one could make it through this weather on horseback," Marcus replied practically. "You're welcome to stay as long as necessary. I have plenty of supplies." As Elizabeth warmed herself by the fire, she studied her unexpected host. Marcus Thompson was taller than she had expected, with dark hair touched by gray and kind eyes that contradicted his reputation for unfriendliness. He moved around his house with quiet efficiency, preparing dinner and making her feel as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. Neither Elizabeth nor Marcus realized that this chance encounter would change both their lives forever, or that their forced proximity during the storm would lead to consequences that would eventually make them both outcasts in the very community where they had once belonged. The blizzard raged for 4 days, trapping Elizabeth and Marcus together in the isolated ranch house. What began as an emergency shelter arrangement gradually evolved into something neither of them had expected: genuine companionship and a growing attraction that surprised them both. On the first morning, Elizabeth woke in the spare bedroom feeling embarrassed about her situation. She had imposed on a man she barely knew, and she was acutely aware of the impropriety of staying alone with him, even under emergency circumstances. When she emerged from her room, she found that Marcus had already prepared breakfast and was preparing to go out to tend his cattle. "The animals need care regardless of the weather," Marcus explained, pulling on his heavy coat. "Please make yourself at home. There are books in the parlor, and help yourself to anything you need from the kitchen." Elizabeth spent the day exploring the house, discovering that it was much more comfortable and well-appointed than she had expected. Marcus clearly took good care of his property, and she could see evidence of a woman's touch in the furnishings and decorations that he had preserved from his marriage. When Marcus returned that evening, cold and tired from battling the storm to care for his livestock, Elizabeth had prepared dinner using supplies from his well-stocked pantry. The simple act of sharing a meal together broke down some of the awkwardness between them. "You didn't need to cook," Marcus said, though he was clearly grateful for the warm food. "I wanted to help," Elizabeth replied. "It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." As they ate, they began to talk more naturally. Elizabeth learned about Marcus's life before his self-imposed isolation, and she shared stories about her marriage to Robert and her struggles since his death. Marcus was struck by Elizabeth's resilience and dignity in the face of hardship. The second day brought no improvement in the weather, but both Elizabeth and Marcus found themselves less anxious about the situation. They settled into a comfortable routine, with Elizabeth helping with household tasks while Marcus managed the outdoor work. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about books, current events, and their memories. Elizabeth discovered that Marcus was far from the antisocial hermit that people described. He was intelligent, well-read, and capable of engaging conversation when he felt comfortable. His isolation seemed to stem more from grief and habit than from any real dislike of human company. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself enjoying Elizabeth's presence more than he had enjoyed anything in years. She brought life and warmth to his house in ways that had nothing to do with cooking and cleaning. Her laughter, her thoughtful questions, and her gentle presence began to awaken feelings he thought had died with his wife. By the third day, both of them were aware that their relationship had shifted beyond simple host and guest courtesy. There was an undeniable attraction growing between them, complicated by their respective situations and the isolated circumstances that had brought them together. "I should probably mention," Elizabeth said carefully as they sat by the fire that evening, "that people in town will talk about my staying here, even though it couldn't be helped." Marcus nodded grimly. "I've been thinking about that too. Small towns have long memories for gossip. Does that worry you?" Elizabeth asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "It should worry me more than it does," he admitted. "But right now I'm more concerned about how you'll be affected. A widow's reputation is more fragile than a hermit's." The fourth day brought clearing skies but roads that were still impassable due to snowdrifts. Marcus could have attempted to get Elizabeth back to town, but neither of them suggested it. They were both reluctant to end what had become the most meaningful human connection either had experienced in months. That evening, as they sat closer together on the sofa than they had in previous days, the unspoken attraction between them finally came to the surface. Marcus reached for Elizabeth's hand and she didn't pull away. When he leaned in to kiss her, she met him willingly, and they both acknowledged that their relationship had moved far beyond emergency shelter. "Elizabeth," Marcus said quietly, "I need you to know that I haven't felt this way about anyone since my wife died. This isn't just loneliness or the circumstances." "I know," Elizabeth replied, her hand still in his. "I feel the same way. I thought I might never care for anyone again after Robert. But you've changed that." Neither of them intended for their relationship to become intimate that night, but the combination of attraction, isolation, and the emotional connection they had developed made it feel natural and right. In the morning, they both knew that everything had changed between them, and that their actions would have consequences neither could fully predict. The roads became passable on the fifth day, and Marcus reluctantly prepared to take Elizabeth back to Millbrook. Both of them knew that returning to town would mean facing questions and gossip about her extended stay at his ranch. But they also understood that she couldn't remain hidden away indefinitely. During the wagon ride to town, they discussed how to handle the inevitable curiosity and speculation. Marcus offered to speak with anyone who questioned Elizabeth's reputation, but she insisted that would only make matters worse. "The best thing is for us to be discreet and let the talk die down naturally," Elizabeth said, though she wasn't entirely convinced this strategy would work. When they reached the outskirts of Millbrook, several people noticed Marcus's wagon bringing Elizabeth home. Within hours, word had spread throughout the small community, that the young widow had spent nearly a week alone with the reclusive rancher. Mrs. Abigail Patterson, the banker's wife and unofficial leader of the town's social hierarchy, was among the first to comment publicly on the situation. 5 days and nights, she told her circle of friends at the church ladies' auxiliary meeting. I'm sure it was all perfectly innocent, but appearances matter, and a widow must be above reproach. Reverend Samuel Wright of the Methodist Church felt obligated to address the situation during his sermon the following Sunday. Without mentioning names, he spoke about the importance of maintaining proper Christian behavior even in difficult circumstances, and the responsibility of community members to avoid situations that might cause scandal. Elizabeth noticed the change in how people treated her immediately. Conversations stopped when she entered the general store. Former friends offered polite but distant greetings instead of their usual warm welcomes. Mrs. Henderson, who had previously been one of Elizabeth's strongest supporters, mentioned that perhaps it would be better if Elizabeth found other arrangements for her laundry work. The social isolation hurt Elizabeth more than she had expected. She had lost not only her husband but now her place in the community, where she had hoped to rebuild her life. The irony wasn't lost on her that helping her survive a blizzard had somehow made Marcus and her both pariahs. Marcus fared no better in town. During his next supply trip, shopkeepers who had previously been cordial were now coolly professional. The banker, Mr. Patterson, made pointed comments about the importance of maintaining community standards when Marcus came to conduct business. People are talking, Thompson, Patterson said bluntly. That young woman has a reputation to protect, and you should have thought about that before keeping her at your place for so long. She would have died in that storm, Marcus replied angrily. Was I supposed to turn her away? You could have brought her to town as soon as the roads were passable, Patterson countered. Instead, you kept her there for nearly a week. People draw their own conclusions about that kind of behavior. Despite the growing social pressure, Marcus found himself unable to stay away from Elizabeth entirely. He made excuses to visit town more frequently, and they arranged to meet discreetly when possible. Their attraction to each other had only grown stronger since her stay at his ranch, and they both struggled with the impossible situation they found themselves in. 6 weeks after the blizzard, Elizabeth realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with both joy and terror. She was carrying the child of a man she had grown to love, but their relationship was already the subject of scandal in their community. An unmarried pregnancy would destroy what remained of her reputation and likely force her to leave Millbrook entirely. Elizabeth spent several days agonizing over how to tell Marcus about her condition. She knew he was an honorable man who would want to do the right thing, but she also understood that marrying her now would confirm all the gossip and speculation that was already circulating about them. When Elizabeth finally found the courage to tell Marcus about the pregnancy, his reaction was exactly what she had expected and feared. He immediately proposed marriage, insisting that he loved her and wanted to build a life with her regardless of what people thought. We'll face whatever comes together, Marcus said, taking her hands in his. I should have asked you to marry me weeks ago. I was being a coward about the gossip. Elizabeth wanted desperately to say yes, but she also knew that their marriage would now be seen as proof that their relationship had been improper from the beginning. A quick wedding followed by a baby would provide ammunition for every busybody and gossip in Millbrook. Marcus, if we marry now, everyone will know why, Elizabeth said. They'll count the months and draw their conclusions. It will confirm every suspicious thing they've been saying about us. I don't care what they think, Marcus replied firmly. I care about you and our child. We'll make our own life, away from their judgment if necessary. Elizabeth realized that Marcus was right about one thing. They would have to create their own happiness, independent of community approval. The question was whether they were strong enough to withstand the social storm that was about to break over them both. Marcus and Elizabeth were married in a simple ceremony at the courthouse, 3 weeks after she told him about her pregnancy. Only Dr. Hayes and his wife served as witnesses, as most of their former friends and acquaintances had made it clear they disapproved of the rushed marriage. Father O'Brien had offered to perform a Catholic ceremony, but Elizabeth, being Methodist, preferred the civil service. Reverend Wright had declined to officiate, citing concerns about the appearance of impropriety and the message it might send to other young people in the community. The news of their marriage spread through Millbrook like wildfire, accompanied by knowing looks and whispered calculations about dates. Mrs. Patterson made no effort to hide her disapproval, announcing to anyone who would listen that the marriage was obviously necessary and reflected poorly on both parties involved. "That poor woman has certainly fallen far from grace," Mrs. Patterson declared at the weekly quilting circle. "First, she gallivants around unescorted during her mourning period. Then she compromises herself with that hermit rancher, and now she's forced into a hasty marriage. It's a cautionary tale for all our young ladies." The social consequences were swift and severe. Elizabeth found herself completely ostracized by the church ladies who had previously provided her with support and friendship. The Methodist Church made it clear that she was no longer welcome in their women's auxiliary, and several families requested that their children avoid her entirely. Marcus faced his own challenges in town. Business owners who had previously been eager for his patronage now treated him with cold professionalism. The banker, Mr. Patterson, began making pointed comments about the character of people he chose to do business with, and Marcus worried that his loans might be called in early. Even more hurtful was the reaction of some people Marcus had considered friends. Tom Bradley, who owned the feed store and had known Marcus for 20 years, could barely bring himself to be civil during business transactions. "I'm disappointed in you, Marcus," Bradley said during one particularly uncomfortable encounter. "That young woman deserved better than to be taken advantage of during a vulnerable time. You should have known better." Marcus tried to explain that their relationship had developed naturally, and that he genuinely loved Elizabeth. But few people were willing to listen. The narrative had already been established in the community's mind. The isolated rancher had taken advantage of a grieving widow, and their hasty marriage was proof of his improper behavior. Dr. Hayes remained one of their few supporters in town, though even he expressed concerns about how they were handling the situation. "You're both good people," he told Marcus during a private conversation, "but you've given the gossips exactly what they wanted. A little more patience might have saved you both a lot of heartache." Elizabeth struggled with the isolation more than Marcus did, since she had been more integrated into the town's social fabric. She missed the companionship of other women and worried about how their children would be treated when they were old enough to attend school or church. "Maybe we should consider moving somewhere else," Elizabeth suggested one evening as they sat in their kitchen, both feeling the weight of the community's disapproval. "We could start fresh where no one knows our history." Marcus was tempted by the idea, but he also felt angry about being driven away from the land where he had been born and raised. "Why should we run away because other people choose to judge us?" he asked. "We did nothing wrong." The situation worsened when Elizabeth began showing signs of her pregnancy. Every appearance in town was met with stares and whispered comments about the timing. Some people made cruel jokes about premature babies, while others openly speculated about when the baby had actually been conceived. Elizabeth found shopping for supplies increasingly difficult as merchants treated her with barely concealed hostility. Mrs. Henderson, at the dry goods store, who had once been friendly, now served Elizabeth with cold efficiency and avoided making eye contact. The final blow came when Reverend Wright visited their ranch uninvited, ostensibly to offer spiritual guidance but actually to deliver a lecture about repentance and the importance of acknowledging wrongdoing. "The community is watching to see how you handle this situation," the Reverend told them both. "A public acknowledgement of your mistakes and a demonstration of genuine repentance might help restore your standing." Marcus's patience finally snapped. "Reverend, we have nothing to repent for. We fell in love, we got married, and we're starting a family. If the community can't accept that, then perhaps the community is the problem." After the Reverend left, Elizabeth and Marcus realized they faced a choice. They could continue trying to win back acceptance from people who seemed determined to judge them, or they could focus on building their own happiness independent of community approval. "I think we need to stop caring what they think," Elizabeth said firmly. "We know the truth about our relationship, and that should be enough." Marcus agreed, though both of them knew that their decision to reject the community's judgment would make their social isolation even more complete. As Elizabeth's pregnancy progressed, she and Marcus discovered that their forced isolation from Millbrook's social circle had unexpected benefits. Without the constant pressure to conform to community expectations, They were free to build their relationship on their own terms and focus on preparing for their child's arrival. Elizabeth threw herself into making their ranch house into a real home. She used her sewing skills to create curtains, quilts, and baby clothes, transforming the previously stark interior into a warm and welcoming space. Marcus, inspired by her efforts, began making improvements to the house that he had neglected for years. Together they planned a nursery in the small room that had served as Marcus's office. Elizabeth painted cheerful designs on the walls while Marcus built a cradle and shelving for baby supplies. The project gave them both a sense of purpose and hope for the future that helped counteract the negativity they faced in town. Dr. Hayes continued to provide medical care for Elizabeth, making monthly trips to the ranch to monitor her health. He became their primary source of news from town and one of their few remaining connections to the outside world. People are starting to focus on other scandals, Dr. Hayes reported during one visit. The hardware store owner's son was caught gambling, and there's talk that the mayor's been skimming money from the town treasury. Your situation is becoming old news. Elizabeth hoped this meant their social exile might eventually end, but Marcus was less optimistic. Even if they stop talking about us, they won't forget, he said. We'll always be the couple who had to get married. As her due date approached, Elizabeth faced a practical concern. Who would assist with the birth? Dr. Hayes would be there for medical supervision, but traditionally, other women in the community would help with the delivery and provide support during recovery. Elizabeth's estrangement from the church ladies meant she would have to manage without this customary assistance. I can handle it, Elizabeth insisted, when Marcus expressed worry about the situation. Women have been having babies without committees of helpers for thousands of years. Marcus arranged for Mrs. O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant woman who lived on a farm outside town, to come stay with them during Elizabeth's final weeks. Mrs. O'Sullivan had experience as a midwife and was less concerned with social proprieties than with practical matters of health and safety. You're both good people, caught up in small-town foolishness, Mrs. O'Sullivan told them bluntly. I've seen real wickedness in my time, and this isn't it. Don't let these narrow-minded busybodies make you feel ashamed of finding happiness. Elizabeth went into labor on a cold February morning, 8 months after the blizzard that had brought her and Marcus together. The birth was difficult but successful, resulting in a healthy son they named David after Marcus's father. When Dr. Hayes examined the baby, he made an observation that would prove significant for the family's future in Millbrook. This is a full-term baby, he said quietly to Marcus. There's no question about that. He's not premature at all. Marcus understood the implications immediately. David's size and development clearly indicated that he had been conceived after Elizabeth and Marcus were married, not during her stay at the ranch during the blizzard. The baby's healthy appearance would eventually make it obvious to anyone with medical knowledge that the pregnancy had not been the reason for their quick marriage. However, Marcus and Elizabeth decided not to actively publicize this information. They had learned to value their privacy and independence from community opinion, and they didn't want to appear to be seeking vindication or approval. Let them think what they want, Elizabeth said as she held her newborn son. We know the truth, and that's all that matters. The months following David's birth were among the happiest in either Marcus or Elizabeth's recent memory. Their love had deepened through the challenges they had faced together, and they discovered that their isolation had actually strengthened their bond rather than weakening it. Marcus proved to be a devoted father, spending hours with David and helping Elizabeth with the demanding schedule of caring for a newborn. Elizabeth marveled at how gentle and patient Marcus was with the baby, seeing a side of him that his previous isolation had hidden. Their ranch prospered during this period as well. Marcus's focus on his land and livestock, combined with Elizabeth's practical management of their household, created a level of productivity and success that impressed even their critics in town. Thompson's place is looking better than it has in years, Tom Bradley admitted reluctantly to his wife. Whatever else you might say about his choices, he's certainly turned his life around. As David grew from an infant to a toddler, his obvious health and normal development began to quietly disprove the rumors about his conception. People in town started to notice that the timeline didn't match the gossip they had spread, but few were willing to admit they had been wrong. Marcus and Elizabeth realized they had reached a turning point. They could either continue to live in self-imposed exile from their community, or they could begin the slow process of rebuilding relationships with their neighbors. The question was whether Millbrook was ready to accept them back, and whether they still wanted to be part of a community that had judged them so harshly. The opportunity for Marcus and Elizabeth to begin reintegrating into Millbrook's community came unexpectedly during David's second year. A devastating fire swept through the business district, destroying several buildings including the general store and the church. The disaster brought out the best in people, temporarily setting aside personal grievances in favor of community cooperation. Marcus arrived in town with his wagon loaded with supplies and tools within hours of hearing about the fire. Without waiting for an invitation or worrying about how he might be received, he immediately began helping with the cleanup and recovery efforts. Elizabeth followed the next day with food she had prepared for the volunteers and families who had lost their businesses. She worked alongside women who had shunned her for 2 years, focusing on the immediate needs of fire victims rather than past disagreements. "Mrs. Thompson," said Mrs. Patterson, approaching Elizabeth hesitantly as she distributed sandwiches to tired volunteers. "I want to thank you for this kindness. The Hendersons lost everything in the fire, and your food will make a real difference to their family." Elizabeth accepted the thanks graciously, not mentioning the irony that Mrs. Patterson was now grateful for help from someone she had recently considered a social pariah. "We're all neighbors," Elizabeth replied simply. "When disaster strikes, we help each other." Over the following weeks, as the community worked together to rebuild what had been lost, Marcus and Elizabeth found themselves gradually welcomed back into the social fabric of Millbrook. Their generosity during the crisis, combined with the obvious strength of their marriage and family, began to change people's perceptions. Dr. Hayes played a crucial role in their rehabilitation by quietly correcting misconceptions about David's birth timing. When Mrs. Henderson made a comment about premature babies, Dr. Hayes firmly stated that David had been a full-term, healthy infant with no signs of prematurity. Sometimes, Dr. Hayes said pointedly, people rush to judgment without having all the facts. The Thompson baby was clearly conceived after his parents were married, not before. This medical testimony from a respected community member gradually shifted the narrative about Marcus and Elizabeth's relationship. People began to realize that their assumptions about the couple's behavior had been wrong. Though few were willing to admit their mistake directly, the new Methodist minister, Reverend Collins, who had replaced Reverend Wright, took a different approach to pastoral care. He visited the Thompson Ranch and invited them to return to church, emphasizing forgiveness and community healing rather than judgment and exclusion. "Every family deserves a place in our church community," Reverend Collins told his congregation. "We must examine our own hearts and ensure that we're acting with Christian charity rather than worldly judgment." Marcus and Elizabeth were cautious about returning to full community participation. They had learned to value their independence and weren't willing to subject themselves to renewed gossip or criticism. However, they gradually began attending church services and participating in community events. Their careful reintegration was helped by the arrival of other newcomers to Millbrook who provided fresh subjects for gossip and speculation. The town's attention shifted to new scandals and controversies, allowing Marcus and Elizabeth to rebuild their relationships without constant scrutiny. Elizabeth's skills as a seamstress became valuable to the community during the rebuilding process, as many families needed new clothes and household items to replace what they had lost in the fire. Her willingness to help without reference to past slights impressed people who had previously judged her harshly. Marcus's expertise with construction and his willingness to share tools and labor made him a valuable contributor to the rebuilding effort. Business owners who had previously treated him coldly now sought his advice and assistance with their reconstruction projects. By David's 3rd birthday, the Thompson family had achieved a comfortable place in Millbrook society. They weren't at the center of social activities, but they were accepted and respected members of the community. Their marriage had proven to be strong and loving, and their family life was obviously happy and stable. Elizabeth became pregnant again, and this time the news was met with congratulations rather than speculation. Mrs. Patterson, who had been one of their harshest critics, offered to organize a baby shower, though Elizabeth politely declined the gesture. "We prefer to keep our family celebrations private," Elizabeth explained, not wanting to seem ungrateful, but also not wanting to pretend that the past conflicts hadn't happened. Their daughter, Sarah, was born healthy and welcomed by a community that had learned to accept the Thompson family completely. The contrast between the reactions to David's birth and Sarah's arrival highlighted how much attitudes had changed. Marcus and Elizabeth had learned valuable lessons about community, judgment, and the strength that comes from standing by your principles. Their marriage had been tested by social pressure and emerged stronger for having weathered the storm together. "Do you ever regret how everything happened?" Elizabeth asked Marcus one evening as they watched their children play in their yard. "I regret